where things are recorded based on if you're presenting or not. Okay, where did we leave off last time?
That is a very good question. We had
Yeah,
gone through the mapping pieces. We thought that this would work well. We had talked about separating out the requirements so that those could be published as unique documents
Right.
by the owners of the actual requirement set. And then we had talked about claims. And there was something, can you scroll down a little bit? It was something around the confidence scores we were talking about, where those would be appropriate. Whether it was in the claim or in the other, or maybe we needed it in both, I think. And then we refactored some of the external references out. I don't remember where we were going from there. That was kind of the stuff that we were looking at last time.
yeah, I think we moved the confidence of a particular claim, that's with the claim itself.
Mhm.
Um,
Is the claim always like I meet that requirement, or can you say I partially meet it, or I do something similar, or like is it always yes or
yeah,
no?
this is what this conformance is. So
Yeah.
like my example that I always throw out is like, do you educate all your developers yearly on security practices? And yes, I educate 80% of them.
Yeah, and if you scroll up a little bit to give you a little bit more context, Jeff, what we're saying here is that we are attesting to a map, and that map includes one or more requirements, because you can have there's an object in there of a requirement. Then there's a list of claims that map to that requirement. Each of those claims then has a claim ref, an evidence ref from the other array down below. And here's where we put in the level of conformance, how confident we are in it, and any other notes or things like that could be put in here.
Okay, but the claim is
Yep.
just text, right? You could say like, well, I kind of do this, but not really.
Yeah, the
Or
claim
something.
is the
Yeah.
object down below there, starting at line 90. That's the actual claim with the details of it. And then, you know, the free field comment is up in the confidence area up in 76. So are you saying
Wait, can you say
basically
that one more time? What I'm confused on the claim at line
yeah, so
90 and the claim on line 72.
right. So the claim in line 72 is a reference to the actual claim object itself in 89.
I see.
So that's where it's a claim ref, right? We're referring to that claim. And we're saying that for this claim, with this evidence supporting this claim, we say we meet this requirement. And we are confident in this way. And then any other additional comments we could put in there. So are you saying that for the claim itself, you would also want additional comments down there in the claim?
Well, I'm just wondering what the claim is. Like, is it like, can you only claim like I am 80% conformant?
No, well,
Or is there other ways you could claim that? Like, well, I do that thing, but I do it in a different way.
yeah, and I think that's where those comments would come in. So if the requirement was I train my developers in security, we have developer security training program. We could say the claim is yes, we have a developer security training program, and then here is the evidence that shows the training, right? And that would be in the evidence array up there, and then we are conformant with this 80% of the time because only 80% of our folks have gone through the training. And if we are doing it in a different way, we could say, no, we're 100% conformant because of this evidence. And then in the comment, we could say, we are doing this via some other method. So like that comment would be up there in that attestation mapping section is kind of what I think we were thinking, or it would be in the notes there.
Yeah.
And
I
I see
think
we
the
have this.
nice thing about the way we have it structured here is that we've got the attestations separated out from the claims and the evidence itself. So if we want to actually attest the claims and use the same claims and the same evidence for multiple standards, we absolutely can do that.
And likely the same claims and evidence might support multiple requirements.
Yep. We support that
Yep.
with this model as well then.
Yeah.
But there could be different reasons for the other requirements. And so with this model, we have a way of saying via the notes, you know, what those different reasons might be for the different requirements. So I think that this is pretty flexible.
I guess, yeah, I'm just curious if the evidence here supports that claim 1, right?
Yep.
Why wouldn't it go down here? Like, why would you use different evidence to support a claim? Why wouldn't it always be the same evidence? If you make a claim, you would think the same evidence would apply to that claim every time.
Yeah, why did we do that? There was, I think we went over a scenario for that. I just don't remember.
Yeah, if you were creating evidence and it actually supports multiple claims.
Yeah, that would be fine, but then you could list it under the claims here in the
Then you'd have,
implementation of the claim.
that would be repetition. So I guess from a dry perspective, it would be better in air quotes to have it separately, because then you could reuse it. But if you're saying it's better to be explicit there, I think we could like explore that and try to understand why. So like an example might be, you know, developer training, right? And evidence of that could check a few different boxes. It could check that you have a developer training program. It could check also the box for just that you enable training from like a personal growth perspective, because those can be different requirements, right? So you could reuse that one piece of evidence for both of those claims or both of those requirements would be maybe one example. If you've got,
so I'm just thinking, like, if I have some evidence, like I can reuse the evidence in multiple claims, but whenever I do the claim, it would have the same evidence. So I was just thinking,
so
rather than repeat it up above every time, like instead you could make it part of the claims map here.
So you're saying part of the claim itself, instead of having it in the mapping above, you would put the evidence in the claim here.
Then you wouldn't have to repeat it every time you use that claim. That's where I'm thinking there'll be a lot of duplication, because you could make the same claim numerous times and you'd have to repeat all the evidence every time.
Yeah, I see. Steve, if you could scroll up a little bit. I think what Jeff is suggesting here is taking the evidence array out of 73, bringing it back down into the claim itself, down in like 91, 92, somewhere around there.
And then you might want to ask about conformance and other things. I guess that's where I was getting hung up.
Yeah, this is how much of it you're actually doing. And so instead of having a Boolean, are you doing it or yes or no? This is a sliding scale. And once we kind of figure out where evidence goes, then I think after conformance, we need to tackle poems.
So does this mean that I'm 80% conformant in meeting the claim?
Yes.
Or 80% conformant in meeting the requirement? Because I think if it's relative to the claim, then it should be in the claim and not here.
Well, this is the claim.
Well, no, this is the,
wait.
Yeah, I see Jeff's point.
This is the attestation though.
Yeah.
Because again, you can use, I mean, the same claim could be used in multiple standards, but the standards could actually be worded differently. And you might be 100% in one standard and only 80% in the other.
How could you do that? I mean, if the claim is tied to the requirement.
For example, I mean, words matter, right? So if you had a requirement that says, do you educate your developers in security training? Yes, I do. Do you educate all of your developers in security training?
Yeah,
not quite.
So wouldn't that mean
Yeah,
there's
but
a change in requirement? Like associated requirement will be different? I mean, I get what Jeff is trying to say. I mean, instead of making conformance part of the claim, making it part of the requirement would make the specific change you just mentioned, like inclusion of an all users, would be a different requirement at that point, right?
It would be.
Yeah,
So I'm talking about a situation where you're actually using the same claim, the same evidence to support multiple standards. So
Exactly.
in this
So
particular attestation, I'm going to claim conformance of 100%, but in a different attestation, same claim, same evidence, I'm going to supply 100%.
yeah, and I think actually that maybe we want to take a step back for 1 second, because I think there's two different things here. When I'm claiming something, I have a certain confidence when I am claiming it. However, the attester, the person who's signing off on it, may have a different view of how conformant we are or aren't. So maybe we actually need to support it in both places, because they actually have different intents at that point. Does that make sense? Because
Okay, so from the
I'm the person who's
from
making
the
the claim,
person making the claim,
yeah,
versus the person that's actually
if I'm an ops
agreeing with
guy
you.
who's trying to generate the evidence and make the claim that yes, we do this, right? I am going to have a certain degree of confidence in what I'm saying, right? And here's the evidence to support what I'm saying. But when it gets to the auditor, who theoretically would be the person doing this attestation, they may have a different perspective on whether I actually meet the requirement or not. So that's why I would suggest we probably need to support it in both places, because it means things in those different areas. The claim level means something different than the attestation level.
Yeah, I could see that. We deal with that all the time. Do this? Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Do you do it well? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So maybe we
Good old
do want it in
internal
both
audits.
places. And I don't know if we'd want to use the same nouns or not, but I do see a use for it in both places. And that might be a reason to keep this is where I think it gets a little tricky from an evidence perspective, because in theory, you would want the auditor to have evidence to back up why they think that. So would they need to add additional evidence at that point to say like, oh, no, you didn't. Here's a couple of examples from the logs where you didn't do this, right? And then that's why they have less confidence in our ability to meet our claim, right? So that might be a case for keeping evidence separate up in the mapping, or maybe having an additional evidence field for something where it's contrary.
So we have confidence up here, but again, you said different noun.
Or maybe the same noun, maybe not. I don't know.
I don't know how I can be conformant against something when I don't actually know what I'm conforming to.
Confidence would be the better noun down there.
Yeah.
Well, isn't in one case you're conforming to the claim, and in the other case you're asking the question, do the claims add up to meet this requirement?
Yeah.
And I think maybe we should think about using a separate word for that. Like, requirement and conformance to me go together 100%. Like I conform to that requirement, and that makes sense. But maybe when we say claim, maybe we say like, it's more like reasoning, or it's like, how well did you make that argument? Is it compelling? Something like that, to just try to differentiate between the two. Because I think we're going to run into all kinds of confusion if we use the same word for both of those things.
Agreed.
So maybe it's like strength of argument. Like it's you made a claim, you presented some evidence. How strong was the case that you presented?
Can we use the word justification? Or is that more of a description type of thing?
What if we grab
mind
this? What if we grab this confidence block that exists in 75 down to 80, put it down in claims.
Yes.
Right, because that I think is where it was originally. And I think it does make sense given the conversation we have. But then if we can go back up to the mapping for a second.
Yeah.
I think up here, if we're having this as an attestation for a requirement, I would think then that the conformance and the confidence should be pulled out of this claims map and should instead be at this requirement object that starts at line 69. Basically, it should be at the same level of indentation as requirement, because we're now saying that the conformance and the confidence of this claim and evidence set by the attester meets this requirement or doesn't meet this requirement. So I think this allows us to be a lot more dry now, right? But it still lets the attester supply additional evidence to say, like, no, you don't quite meet this, or this is contrary to your claim.
Yep.
Does this make sense?
So help me with that use case a little
sense.
bit. I usually wouldn't imagine an attester going back and changing the evidence, or
not changing the
on
evidence. So when we're going through an audit, right? Like SOC 2, we're going through that now. You know, they say, oh, you give us your log data, give us your log streams, let us see if you're actually meeting the spec that you say you're meeting. And, you know, I say, okay, you know, we have robust access controls with, you know, these roles are the only ones who are allowed to access production, for example. If they find examples that show that that's not the case, I may have made that claim that nobody but these roles accesses production, and I may have supplied evidence to that account. The auditor might find contrary evidence, and then that might change it. And if that's not a use case we want to support, that's okay. But I think that that's a real use case.
My only question is, like, would they want to update this attestation, or would they just want to say, like, no, it's wrong, you got to go fix it, and push it back down to the person who created this in the first place?
Yeah, with something like SOC 2, they do specifically call out exceptions, right? That's in that SOC 2 letter that they will say, like, you had this many breaches of this particular policy. So this would be a kind of the way that they could, you know, provide the evidence to show that that happened.
Yeah. All right.
Should that be called out separately from a single bucket of evidence towards a single requirement? I mean, if everything goes under evidence bucket, is it positive, or is it an exception?
So maybe instead of doing something like this where we had that claims mapping, you're saying maybe just still allow for multiple claims with the evidence backing that claim, but then have something to say like exceptions or no, like.
Well, what if it's like counter evidence or something?
Yeah, something like that. I mean,
yeah,
because there's kind of positive evidence and negative evidence here, and I think it's really good to note negative evidence and take it into account, and maybe you can still meet the requirement even with some negative evidence.
Yeah, I think that's a good call. The question here is do we really need that claims to be the way that it is right now? Because originally we had intended it to be a mapping. Maybe now it doesn't need to be as much of a mapping here. Maybe we could pull the main evidence down into the claim again, right? So we could move that evidence array down into the claim.
I like it.
We could keep the claims array here 70 as just an array of claims, claim refs.
Yep.
And then we could have another array up here in the attestation with like counter evidence or counter claims or something, not counter claims, that wouldn't make sense. But yeah, that might work well then.
I would just put positive evidence and negative evidence here under the claim. And like, this is the claim, and there's some supporting evidence and some evidence against it. And then it's kind of up to the assessor to say whether it actually satisfies the requirement, even with all that whole complete body of evidence.
So you said move the array of evidence down to claims, right? That is what you said, right?
Mhm. And then
And
change
so
this
this
to just
becomes a
be an
very
array of
simple
claim
mapping.
reps. Yep.
Exactly. So this becomes just like something like this, for example,
Right.
right?
Yep.
Okay, got it. So the claims and evidence are all reusable, but you can have multiple evidence per claim. Fine.
Mhm.
And what else?
So
I think
I
I'm
think the
missing
question was,
something.
where should counter evidence go, or negative evidence?
Counter evidence.
Thinking from an example implementation would be, your auditors are doing it. They're the ones doing the attestations. So it would make sense to me to be there. However, me making the claim, I should also be aware of that counter evidence. So it would make sense for it to be down there too.
Yeah.
I
it's
could
just
I
like
could see it going
a
either
peer
way.
of evidence.
Yeah, I could see it going either way.
So
Can you
Derek, so
give like an example of counter evidence just so I kind of can wrap my head around it a little bit?
Well, let's say you made a claim that says, I use prepared statements everywhere in my code base. And you say, and I checked it with, some static analysis tool. A piece of counter evidence might be like, well, we detected with runtime analysis, we detected a non-prepared statement here.
Okay. Okay.
It might not invalidate that you met the requirement, like, but I think it's useful to have a place to put all the evidence, pro and con.
How's that different than conformance, right? If you say like, hey, I'd say I have these automated statements everywhere, but I know it's only applicable in 40%.
This would drive the conformance score. Like this
Right.
would be a thing that would back up the attestation that your conformance is only 80%. So going back to the developer example, right? We say that we make the claim that we do developer training, right? But we have counter evidence that shows we only do it for 80%. And so that backs up that number.
So
how would you deal with a requirement that says like, the requirement says you got to build a threat model, and you say, I have evidence, here's my positive evidence, I have a threat model, but it's awful. It's just like 3 boxes and an arrow. How would you, could you just,
that would be
would you
something
make-
with the confidence, right? From an attester's perspective being, hey, this isn't sufficient, or maybe this is not sufficient, wouldn't it?
but that's not confidence that I met the requirement, is it? Isn't that confidence in the evidence or like the strength of the argument?
that's the confidence on the claim, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, is like, it's not on the, maybe we should think about putting the confidence down in the claims.
We did. We
Yeah.
kind of have it in both places now.
Oh, so we have it in both places now.
Yeah.
Yep.
So the person making the claim can also sort of say what their confidence is in that claim, or if they know that there's things they
Okay.
can supply what their mitigation strategy is. But then the attesters, the people who are doing the audit, thinking again that it's a separate role, they would be able to say, yes, we agree with this conformance, and here's why, here's our confidence in that and why. We're kind of reusing
Okay, so
that object.
let me play this back and let me see if I get this right. So I have evidence that supports a claim, and the confidence tells me how well that evidence supports that claim. And then at the next level up, I've got claims that support a requirement, and the confidence telling me how well those claims support that requirement.
Yeah, I think that's the idea. I mostly, again, from the thought that these would be different roles, different people doing those pieces.
Yeah, I'm in my head, I'm still, and I don't want to take this down a rat hole here, but in my head, I still have this idea that a requirement here is really just a top level claim. And then what we have as claims are really just subclaims, and those subclaims should have subclaims, and it should all be just a nested structure that allows us to create the shape of this argument however we want. I'm not sure I see requirement as anything different other than a top level claim.
One of the reasons
that actually, yeah, that actually I think we discussed that last time. We broke out standards into, so standards you can describe, you know, in this case, OMB 2218 as an
A
example,
set of
which
requirements.
has a bunch of requirements. And then you can optionally have parent requirements as well. So you can create that hierarchy structure if you want. And then each one of these requirements, whether it's a parent or a child, is going to have a BOM ref, which then you can then link to in all of your claims. Now the claims themselves are not hierarchical; they don't need to be, but
So
the
the claims are
requirements
just the
themselves
leaves
are.
of the tree. The
Yeah,
claims are
and
the
there,
leaves of the tree, and the requirements are the branches.
yeah, and I think the idea with this approach was to try to empower people to publish requirements in a machine readable manner, you know, as a
Yeah.
standard set, and then allow that to be reused by, for example, admissions controllers or things like that. So the owner of the requirements of this standard could publish this in a machine readable way, which we can then map to with the people who are making the claims that we meet the requirements can make their claims independently of what the requirement actually is published from wherever it's published.
So the policy author can be separate from the person who is generating the claims and the evidence.
Yep.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so that's great. The standards guy publishes the tree, and then projects just fill in the leaves.
Yep.
Yep. I'm trying to envision like an OWASP scenario, Jeff, where like take for example ASVS, right? They could literally create like machine readable format of standards, all of the requirements in ASVS, along with the levels, right?
Yep.
Of each of the, you know, so I mean, OWASP is not unique in its, you know, use of levels. There's it's widely used for maturity models.
Yeah.
But yeah, I kind of envision like in the future, all OWASP projects, standards and maturity models could use something like this and publish in a machine readable format. So if you want to attest to ASVS or MSCVS or whatever, SAM, you could theoretically do that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. I think
and-
that all that's great.
Yeah, and it gets really beautiful if you publish that out at a well-known URL. Then we can link to it via the URI references here, and it becomes easy to download them, to version control them, everything at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we could bootstrap that at OWASP by just taking standards and machine readabilizing them and publishing them at a certain URL.
Yeah, it'd be huge.
Not a lot of
That
work.
alone would be a huge advantage.
Yep.
And then in this document, one of the talking points from last week where we left off was, should we be separating this into two standards where we have that requirements thing as its own standard? Should we be keeping them as one standard where they can be easily combined into one document like this? We'd gone back and forth on that conversation a few times as well, because we did see how that having the ability to publish that out could be a huge win by itself. So I think that, you know, there's a lot of thought that we could go through on that one as well, back and forth. Does it make sense for us to have this as one standard, one document? Does it make sense for us to keep it separate, keep it in a way where it could be hybridized and pulled together? I think there's a lot of back and forth on that in particular as well.
I mean, I'm a big fan of keeping it in one spec and one standard. Just as I think everyone's doing right now, we're like merging a lot of SBOMs. And that capability already exists. I'd hate to like have to now generate new tooling just to be able to merge these two specs together. They're separate.
I was
Yeah,
gonna go the
I
other
think as
way.
long
It's
as
like,
we,
I would,
I think as long as we can decouple these things, I think that's the most important aspect. Keeping them both in one standard, I think, is really convenient, especially for internal policies, and using this standard as kind of for claims for internal audit type of thing, where you're only dealing with a single organization. You're only going to use the one format. But as long as we can decouple both of these things, I think we should be in a happy place.
so Steve, does that mean that, like, I'm a software development project in a big organization, right? And maybe they have turned their secure coding standard, it's an internal thing. They've turned it into a set of requirements here. They could publish that separately, and I could just publish the piece for my piece of code that says, hey, here's how I meet these requirements, and here's the evidence. So I just really publish just the claims. That's what I would love to do. I'd just love to have a reference to that standard document.
That's, I think that's the idea, but keeping it in the same place gives the tooling, from a tooling perspective, is what we are more concerned about, in keeping the standard in the same place.
Yeah, we don't want to have to recreate tools if we don't need to.
Yeah, and then we could just make sure to basically namespace this as we go through, like we have here. Keep the top levels very clear and concise.
Yep.
Yeah, this is exciting. If you scroll up for a second, the thought with the standards there was that it could be an external publisher or an internal publisher. It wouldn't really matter. The standard could be from an external thing like the OMB, could be, you know, an internal compliance team standard that's published out.
So at the end of it, I think we should definitely define what's a complete document. What makes a complete document in this case, because we are keeping optional, like if there is standards, others become optional, right? Or others don't exist.
So what do you mean by that? Like, is a complete document one that references or includes a set of requirements and has a claim for each requirement? And I'm just curious, like, do you have to have a claim for every requirement? What happens if you don't?
So that is a schema of the requirement, right? So there is also a schema, like the schema of the document itself. If I have a standards, should I have claims and attestation attached to it? Or can I have that part of the standards, or should the standards always be an independent document?
Yeah, and I think that's where I was coming back to here, because there are that's one of the reasons I was suggesting we might want to consider separating them, because the standards themselves, in this document here as we have it, we are trying to attest to one or more standards with our piece of software. So we're going to be bundling one or more standards from some location. And the standards themselves would be published, you know, potentially in this format, and we would then include it in, or we might reference it externally. But like, that's the kind of thing that we may want to be able to support two things separately. Or we could say that this is a standard layout and specification, and you could include just a standard, or you could include the standard and the claims. So there's a couple different ways we could slice it, and maybe keeping it as one overall schema, but saying that there's these intended use cases where it could just publish one or more standards, right? So we would want to support the collection of standards like we have here, as one specific use case. And then also that we conform to said standards in another use case. And then maybe we do want to support just making claims. I think that's something where we need to think it through a little bit.
So I would think that to generate one of these things, I would have multiple steps in filling in these claims, right? Like, some of them I'll answer during the pipeline. As it runs, I'll run some tools, then I'll generate some evidence and I'll patch it in here. But then there's other things that, you know, maybe I've got to go query Salesforce to see who's received the training, or, you know, there's probably going to be multiple steps in generating this. So you know, we want to be able to support that, like partial attestations.
Yes.
And that's where, like, generating that Salesforce thing, that's a piece of evidence, right? And so that would be just another thing generating an evidence item, right? And I could see this kind of being like a for lack of a better example, just a bunch of DynamoDB tables, one for claims, one for evidence, one for standards, you know, where you're just building those out there, and then you're doing, you know, cross-table queries to build what this end attestation actually looks like, for example.
And all of those are valid, like valid attestation JSONs.
Yeah,
like evidence as a separate JSON, claims plus evidence as a separate JSON, right?
And we could do that then just with, again, the top level namespacing here. If we've got claims at the root, we've got evidence at the root, and we've got standards at the root. And each of those is kind of their own domain. And when you put it all together, then you can do, the full attestation for a software artifact with everything bundled together. But this actually would give you tremendous benefit in general, because you could also do substeps like salsa could be done via this, and showing, that yes, we've met the requirements for this. And now my admissions controller can check for that and then allow the software to be ingested there as well. So like this becomes very flexible and very useful from a few perspectives, I think, if we take that approach.
I'm going to go back to in total attestations here quickly. So in your mind, this is where really in total attestations become evidence in this case.
Mm-hmm.
And then you would make an outside claim of that on top of it.
Yep. Then this could be kind of like the policy layer on top of it, in theory.
Okay. And that's where, again,
Yep.
having like that data field is very beneficial, because you can embed the JSON of that directly in. Okay.
Yep.
I really like this. We've done a really good job with this.
I think we do need to try to actually leverage it a couple times, do a couple like examples for different standards or parts of standards, make sure each of the fields
Yeah.
makes sense and that kind of thing. But I think we're starting to drill into a really good structure.
I think so too. One thing that I think we need to flesh out, because it's going to come up sooner rather than later, is we've got the confidence, right? Both places, which is fine. They have different purposes.
Mhm.
But we've had mitigation strategy, which basically is what this is as well. So let's talk a little bit about mitigation strategy. So if I don't actually conform to something completely, what am I going to do about it? What am I going to do? What is my time to be able to do it in?
Probably the simplest cases, like where a requirement just doesn't apply, right? Like there's something that says I've defended against SQL injection, but I don't use a SQL database or something, right? So like, I'd love to say I'm conformant, but I need to fill in this. I don't think of it as mitigation strategy exactly. I'm like, it's alternative. It's like some other way.
Thou shalt must do prepared statements, but I don't use SQL, so it doesn't apply to me.
Right, but that would be the
like,
claim, right? And then the auditor
Right.
would be saying, yeah, we agree with that assessment.
So what about the educating developers 80%? So take that example. What is my plan to do the other 20%?
Yeah.
And that's where, to answer your question around that POEM URL, not everybody uses that explicit syntax. So maybe this would be a good case for a data object again, because it could be an external link to a mitigation in Confluence. It could be any number of things. So maybe, having POEM URL as an example of one of those data things, because I think you said that URLs could be in there as well, right? In a data block. I'm asking
external references.
External references.
External reference. Yep.
Maybe that's the right thing for the mitigation strategy in general. Because then you could kind of include both in there. You could put in text and actual data for what the mitigation strategy is in this document. You could link to it externally.
Okay, so possibly, well, I mean, does the POEM, do we want to also stay like, I mean, because part of POEM is the milestones. So we could make that text like a wall of text, which I think is fine. Or we could try to apply structure to something that we don't really know in advance, which I'm not really a big fan of, is like trying to apply structure to open source licenses. You really can't do it.
Yeah, and that's where. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm thinking here. Like, isn't this the place where you would argue that the evidence meets the claim? Right, like this is somewhere we've got to say, hey, I've got like these 3 pieces of evidence, and together they create an ironclad case that I met this requirement, or they.
No, this is
or
the
there's-
notes field. That's the notes field. No, we can change the name of notes to something else.
like rationale or
but
something.
Yeah, exactly. But if I don't meet it, what am I going to do about it, and when am I going to do it? That's the mitigation strategy.
Yeah, I feel like that's evidence, but maybe it's a different kind of evidence. I don't know. It's
Yeah, again, we're thinking about, and this is maybe where we shouldn't use the same confidence block for each. But
Yeah.
the idea here was that in this upper section here in the 70s, that is the people who are attesting to, or the auditing people, the folks who are validating this, saying yes or no, right? And then maybe they are referencing a mitigation strategy, or maybe they shouldn't be making a reference to a mitigation strategy. I don't know. But the intended audience for who is making this confidence assessment up here is different than the intended audience who's making it down in the claims section. And I think you could argue that a person making a claim is always going to be confident that they're making it, but I'd like to think people are more honest than that, and will say, no, we've got holes. We know about the holes. That's why we're only confident here 80%. Maybe they'll supply the evidence and say that, yes, we're only 80% conformant. And then the auditor's job becomes easier in theory, but maybe they don't, and the auditor comes across contrary evidence or contra evidence, and then wants to supply that and say, like, no, you're actually not conformant, you're only 80%. And now we need to come up with a mitigation strategy, right, to make sure that you do this. So I kind of think we do need to support it in both areas, but I'm absolutely seeing the confusion in doing that at the same time.
Yeah, so in the lower case, the 80s or 90s here, I would, if I'm making this argument, I would expect to say, like, hey, I've trained all my developers. Here's the 3 pieces of evidence that I've provided, and I feel like that's pretty good. Maybe I think it's about a 90% score, and here's my rationale for that. And then I could explain why I think I met that requirement. But I don't think I'd have a mitigation strategy, because I haven't been dinged on it yet. Like, I'm basically saying I met the requirement. I guess you could have like a plan, right? To say I'm 60% trained, and in the next 6 months I'll do another 30%.
Right.
So I'll be there in a few months.
And that could be somebody who's aware of it and knows that, and is, going to make that claim and is aware of where their training is, but maybe they're not all aware of it. And then the auditor comes in and finds something else. Where do we note that's something else that the auditor finds? And I think that's really in this attestation piece. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just saying, like, that my future plan is, like, to me, it's kind of like a piece of evidence, right? I'm saying, like, I'm not there 100%. That's but just to frame it differently when it's in a claim as opposed to when it's in an attestation. Because in an attestation, it's more like, okay, guy, you failed, but you told me your mitigation strategy, and I'm capturing it here for you, and I'm going to hold you to that. And in 6 months, I'm going to come back and look again.
I actually kind of like the idea of having, the contra evidence just be there, and then, like, the plan of action would be a piece of evidence. It does kind of simplify things. Like, yes, your plan of action exists. Here it is. Here's the evidence for it.
Right. And you could then the attester or the assessor or whatever can take that into account when they're deciding if you're conformant.
Yeah. And if they find something contrary, they can just add additional contra evidence basically to that claim.
Right. Yeah, I trained half my developers. Like, I might provide my own counter evidence, right? Like, I could say, hey, I trained all my developers, but 2/3 of them actually failed the test at the end.
Yep. And so do we really need to capture mitigation strategy as part of confidence then? Because I don't think
In
we
which
really-
case, for claims or
in either case, I'm wondering.
requirements?
And I'm throwing that out there purely as a thought and conversation piece, but like if a mitigation strategy becomes a piece of evidence, do we really even need to have that?
Or maybe it becomes part of, I mean, because, you know, again, you could have the same claim used for multiple different requirements, and in one use of it, you could be 100% compliant, in another, you'd be 80%. And with that, you could have a mitigation strategy.
And mitigation strategy is a set of evidence, set of claims. How are we?
Yeah, I think
I
it's
don't know
just
if we can-
evidence.
Evidence?
Yeah, the existence of the plan, and you could point to the plan. You know,
Okay.
I've allocated funds to this, or I've scheduled it, or I've bought a product, or whatever the mitigation plan is. It's kind of the plan is the plan.
Right, because the evidence actually, the evidence actually has a data block, so you theoretically could put that in there, right?
It even says mitigation in the list of evidence.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed there's like the fifth one in.
Almost like you thought about this before, Jeff. Okay. So if we moved the mitigation strategy up one out of confidence, does that make sense? And then we make mitigation strategy just an array of evidence.
And in case of claim, then the mitigation strategy becomes a plan. Is that how we are?
Well,
thinking?
this would disappear too, right? Which is the same object.
Well, then I hate to be the contra on that one, but what if, you know, I'm making the claim, but I'm already aware of it and I already have the plan, and maybe it should be down in the claim and not up in that other attestation block.
Right. So in that case, it'll be a plan, right? So plan has a bunch of evidence of.
What I'm saying is the line 72 here, maybe we should be cutting that out of there and putting it down in line 86, 87.
So for me, it exists on both places, because one, as an attester, you're saying, okay, I got the evidence of a plan. Now I mean, like Jeff was saying, I'll hold you in the next 6 months. And the other is from a claimant. So I'm a DevOps. I claim I know that there's this mitigation plan I have. So I'll give you evidence of this mitigation plan.
Okay.
So this would only show up if you don't meet this claim. Like if you're saying my confidence is less than 1, or my conformance is less than 1 in the other case, then you would provide a mitigation strategy if you've got one.
Right.
Well,
Yeah, it'd be an optional field.
Yeah, I might be 100% confident with the mitigation strategy in my claim.
Right.
Without that mitigation strategy, I might be 80% confident in my claim. With the mitigation strategy, I now know that I will reach 100%. I have a high degree of confidence then. I think this will generate some confusion and intent for what's used where, but it's the same thing that we had with the confidence statement in general.
Right. And I think we're going to have to spend some really, I mean, once we kind of flesh out and finalize, I think the structure, I think I really want to spend a lot of time, if we can, actually creating good documentation. Because you're absolutely right. People are going to look at this and get confused.
I wonder if there's anything we can do from a nouns perspective or something to change it. Something maybe for us to just kind of think about over the next week is, Does it make sense to reuse the nouns? Does it make sense for us to keep these things separate, or would it be a better way? Is there a better way for us to break it out? I don't know if there is or isn't. I think that is something we should think about going forward. Is there a way for us to cut off that confusion at the pass somehow?
Yeah, I like the use of conformance and mitigation with the requirement, but I think we should look at making different nouns for the claims. I don't think that I don't think those have to be the same. Like the branches and the leaves can have different nouns. And
Maybe for 88 we could do reasoning instead of confidence. Here's my reasoning.
I love that.
Why?
Yeah.
So instead of confidence and a score and a rationale, just reasoning.
Yeah.
Yep.
Keep it simple. Text field.
Text field with your reasoning. You got to explain why that evidence meets that claim. And then you don't really need a mitigation strategy because you can address it in the reasoning.
Well, if you do know though that if you know that you have a more complicated mitigation strategy, you probably would want to create some evidence for that and link it in.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you?
I wonder if we should have categories of evidence, like positive evidence, negative evidence, and mitigation evidence or something, just to help people sort out the evidence structure.
Well, we kind of have that. We've got like test results.
Oh, the type of
mitigation.
evidence. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
So we can make some other, I mean, these are all positive types. What would be an example of a negative type, Jeff?
I think a mitigation, well, yeah, that is a positive summary of a negative.
A negative evidence would be like, some tests that failed. Could be you have some document that shows that only 40% of employees got security training. It's just any evidence that goes counter to the claim. And I think it's great that we show both.
Right. So like metric, it could be used for both. And I think sampling could be used for both. And an expert could be used for both, right?
Most of them could. It's very neutral.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a good thing. We want to empower people to collect evidence, whether it's positive or negative. And really the person who's making the claim or the person who is attesting to the claim would be the one to decide whether it's positive or negative.
Yeah, it just puts a little bit more burden on the reasoning. If you have it separated out into some categories, like inside the claim, you could have positive evidence and negative evidence. And then it's, the reasoning is a little more obvious then, right? You don't have to dig down into stuff. You can just say like, oh, well, there's like, there's clear negative evidence that you didn't do this. So you don't have to dig really much deeper than that. I don't know. It makes the reasoning a little more obvious to me if you have typed evidence. You could still leave the evidence block alone. Like it could be there, but you could just have categories of evidence under the claim.
Yeah, it's like positive evidence array, negative evidence array, or
exactly. Because I
think maybe that's.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think that feeds the structure of the argument.
Maybe we do just leave it as evidence for the claim and then contra evidence for anything that might be against said claim.
Or counter evidence, yeah.
Counter evidence.
I'm good with that.
Cool.
Yeah, I like this because if we need to have multiple things in place to actually mitigate this, we've got the ability to do that. We can easily see if something's a positive or a negative.
Is
Derek, a quick question on
okay, go ahead.
Sorry, Jeff. Just a quick interruption here. So like from a claims perspective, as a claimant, I can generate evidence and counter evidence and give you claims. As an attester, as an auditor, so when I find counter evidence, the way I do it is I create a new claim and say that it doesn't meet the requirements. Is that how we are thinking from our tester's perspective?
I think
I'm like, let's say my auditor finds I'm like not all of the, like not 100% of users have gone through security training. So now in my attestation, I have a claim saying, okay, 100% of users meet the security training. Now, where should the counterclaim go?
I don't think it's a counterclaim. I think that person actually adds counter evidence to the claim.
Counter evidence to, so the claim is created by the auditor itself. Like again, okay, all right.
Well, no. Sorry. So I guess my thought originally when we were having the conversation was that claim kind of becomes a multi-user thing now. It's not really the domain of one person necessarily.
Yep.
So maybe for your point, we should be supporting evidence and counter evidence up in the other section as well, in the attestation section. So
right.
somebody
So
at that point finds it.
So in that case, you'll be a collection of, say it is one counter evidence against a collection of claims, right?
Yep.
So there's not going to be a single mapping of, okay, this, like for this claim, I'm having a counter evidence. It's not, it's going to be a collection of.
Yeah, and you might be aware of counter evidence in both places. You might be aware of it when you're making the claim. You might know that it exists. You might supply that information ahead of time, but your auditor might find it too. So you might, just like we have mitigation strategy in two places, you may want counter evidence up in the mapping up in 67.
All right.
Mm-hmm.
Because to your point there, Manoj, the if we're going to be signing these individual sections, right, and me as a claimant or my system as a claimant is going to be signing that section, right, you're not going to want to add data into that section. So you need to be able to support it in both of those spots.
Yep. Agreed. All right, cool. Sorry, thanks, Jeff. I was trying to clarify.
Yeah, so I think that the output of that conversation though is that line 90, we need to copy and also put up like at line 72, 73. Not the 89 there evidence, right? But the counter evidence.
So right there, basically, right?
Something like that, maybe. I think again, this is all for us to talk through. So
yeah. Jeff, you were saying something, I interrupted. So
yeah, I can't remember. You got me distracted on this now. I'm just, it seems weird to have evidence attached at the attestation
I think
level.
the question here, I think that Manoj was trying to hint at is, if we are saying that the claimant, someone making a claim, may not be aware of counter evidence, right? And you have somebody who's doing an attestation who becomes aware of counter evidence, should they add it into the claim or should they add it into the attestation, which is the area that they're responsible for? And I think the thought process is that if the person or system making the claim isn't aware of it, we should be capturing it maybe in a different area rather than just capturing it as part of the claim.
So in that case, there are two ways, right? So one is I, like as an auditor, I create my own claim and then add it to this requirement.
So you'd have like a negative claim, actually, like this thing doesn't do that.
Right. Either that or I need to have a counterclaim on the requirement, or counter evidence on the requirement saying these are all the claims.
Actually, I think you were right. It should be claims and counterclaims.
That's kind of a nice mapping for this in general.
So that would mean getting rid of this and putting a new, instead of claims, we would add another thing called counterclaims with the same structure.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Oh, well, it could be
Oh, no, it could be,
Claims, right.
yeah, it would still be claims. It would just be another instance of claim. It doesn't need to be counterclaims as a whole new section. It would
Oh.
literally be up in the mapping. You just have an additional array up there called counterclaims. And it would just be
You've got
claim two.
claims and counterclaims.
Yeah.
And then
Okay.
so the structure here is a requirement has claims and counterclaims and some rationale that ties them together. And then claims have evidence and counter evidence and the rationale that ties them together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that it's different nouns, so people don't get confused, but it's the same general structure,
Yep.
which
Yeah.
is it worked. I think that totally works.
Yeah, and we're keeping it isolated now very elegantly by the roles who are accessing the different areas as well.
Yeah. Okay.
I do see that we support signature blocks on the other major objects there, line 80 and up. Did we actually put that in the claims section and evidence section? I think we want to.
Yeah, they should be. So every claim should have a signature, and every evidence should also have a signature. Absolutely.
Just noticed that.
Yep. Good call.
And do we want to keep poem URL out? At line 90.
I was going to take it out. Yeah, I'm going to take that out and add an external reference
Okay.
just to have it, right?
Yep.
We already have external references for attestations and evidence and stuff like that. One more external reference for poem is, I'm sure it'll be useful to somebody.
Yeah, we did make a conscious decision to take out the open CRE stuff and bubble that up to the top level, though. We did make that conscious.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's right here. So that way we're not doing the mapping in the spec.
Yep.
So we're definitely over time.
Oh, wow.
I need to run to another call, but this was a fantastic conversation. We got a lot accomplished today.
Yeah.
I
Yeah, I
feel like
like
we're
it.
in a really good, we're in a really good space right now. Okay. Well, have a great rest of your day, everyone. And I look forward to next week's conversation.
See you all next week.
All right.
Cheers.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.
See you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.